let's talk about the new MacBook Air benchmarks that were just leaked. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps the channel grow and promote this video to a larger audience. Make sure to do that before you continue watching. So yesterday, Apple announced the new M1 chips for their Mac lineup. It's coming to the MacBook Air and the 13-inch MacBook Pro. They've also been throwing around performance improvement numbers that when you compare to the older Macs, the new ones are 3, 4, sometimes 5 times better for certain tasks. Mind you, Apple didn't show any specific benchmarks during the keynote, but they do detail some of those in their websites. Right now, what I want to talk about is the MacBook Air benchmark that's been leaked out of Geekbench, where the single core performance of the M1 chip is at 1687 and the multi-core performance is at 7433. Now, what's interesting about this benchmark result is that this score is actually higher than the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the highest end CPU that Apple has out right now. I'm glad Apple is able to see these kinds of numbers by moving to their own proprietary CPU technology compared to using something off the shelf from Intel or AMD. But it does come with some risks, and before we decide that these chips make the new MacBooks completely worth it, we have to take into account how developers are going to port their apps to the new Macs and whether that's going to happen in a timely manner. One of the big risks you come to when you build your own chips for your computer is software support. And that's especially true when you go from a industry standard architecture to a different architecture for your desktops. If you want to talk about the Apple M1 chip, it's much closer to a CPU you'll see in your phone compared to the ones you see in Windows PCs and the older Macs. The main difference between the ARM-based M1 chip out of Apple and the x86-based architecture that Intel follows is the basic instruction set. You can imagine that all software runs by combining these basic instructions. The key thing to note here is that the instruction set is different between the Apple Silicon chip and the Intel chip, which means that software that's built for the Intel chips or the AMD chips, which are also x86 based, can't be directly run without modification on the Apple Silicon chip. Now, Apple's mitigating this issue somewhat by providing a translation software called Rosetta 2 that'll take the x86 based code that runs on their previous Macs and converts it into a format that they can run on the Apple Silicon chips. So now there is a performance hit with this translation, and for the most part, these translated programs are running at about 60 to 70% of the performance that they would have if they were running on x86 based hardware. For many apps, this isn't a big issue, but if you're doing video editing, transcoding, or gaming, this can be a problem. So you want to bridge this performance gap, and to bridge this performance gap, you're actually going to have to get developers to spend some time supporting these programs over a little bit more manually so that they perform well on Apple Silicon. So that's going to be informed by a couple of different factors, and I think I can comment on those. I've worked as a software engineer for 2 years, and these are the things that I've seen software engineers value when it comes to building software. The most important thing is, and it's the same with designing software, building software, is to not repeat the same work more than once if you don't have to. What does that mean? That means that if you're able to build a single program that can run on multiple devices for a lot of people, you're going to want to build that first. And then you're going to maybe build a different version of that program to run on specialized hardware if it makes sense for the amount of effort you need to put in compared to the amount of return you're going to get. So in this case, that means the proportion of your user base that's actually using this new specialized hardware. So first we have to see how much of the market can we expect Apple to hold realistically with the new Apple Silicon chips. So according to netmarketshare.com, it seems that Apple holds about 10% market share for the desktop and laptop space. That means 1 in 10 computer users are using Mac hardware. Now, that figure can be a little bit misleading because all of the Macs that are in these stats are running Intel chips, and the new silicon-based Macs are just coming out. So depending on how popular these end up being, it could either drive up the market share that Apple holds, especially because some of these devices are now much more accessible from a price to performance ratio, so more people are likely to buy them. Or what might happen is that older Mac users are shifting to the newer Macs, in which case the market share doesn't really change. If you're a company that builds software that's not exclusive to the Mac, so the vast majority of market is running Windows PCs on x86 based hardware, and even part of your Mac market, most of them right now are running x86 based hardware, are you going to develop for the 1% of your users that are running Apple Silicon? At this point, we even know that those users are likely not even the Pro users. Apple didn't update the 16-inch MacBook Pro, their iMacs, or their Mac Pro with Apple Silicon. They updated the MacBook Air and the baseline MacBook Pro. These are for more casual prosumer type users that are likely not impacted as much by the performance hit from using Rosetta 2 as the more pro market users. As a business, will you see the need to port your software over to run natively on Apple Silicon? I think that this translation is going to take at least a year. We're already seeing some pushback from the likes of Facebook and Google, who are not going to be offering Apple Silicon native apps at the launch of the new Apple Silicon Macs. So it seems to me that it's likely not the highest priority for them, especially in the kind of world circumstance that we're in now. They have higher priority, larger business interests elsewhere. So even though the new Macs have amazing benchmark performance with what I'm assuming is a benchmark that's running natively on Apple Silicon and isn't translated, that doesn't mean you're going to see the same type of performance gains from other apps. But if Apple's claims are to be believed, and you're getting 3 times the CPU performance and 5 times the GPU performance with the new Mac chips, even if the Rosetta 2 translated apps are running at 60% of the performance that you could get on the Intel chips, they will still technically run faster on the Apple Silicon chips compared to the equivalent spec MacBook from last gen that were running the Intel chips, just because the new processors are so much better. So that could hold you over until native apps are more common and available. Remember, Apple has committed to switching all of their Macs over to Apple Silicon in the next 2 years, and we're a quarter of the way through that time frame. When the more pro-level Mac devices switch over to Apple Silicon, it's going to become much more compelling for some of these companies to port their apps over to Apple Silicon. You can ignore 0.5% of the market share, but when a full 10% of your Mac users are using Apple Silicon, which that is something that could take years to happen, people tend to keep their Macs for a very long time. But when you do eventually hit that market saturation, let's say when 10% of the desktop laptop market are running Apple Macs that are using Apple Silicon, that market segment becomes much harder to ignore. The other concern I have is with support for the developer community. If you are a developer and you want to develop on Apple Silicon, you're going to need access to Apple Silicon. But all of the tools you use are also going to have to be supported on Apple Silicon. So there's kind of a chain effect. Like if you're a software engineer building an app for a consumer, your consumer could be another app developer who needs your application to build a game. If you're a game engine developer and you're building something for the Mac, and the game developers use Macs, you need your game engine to work for them so that they can develop Apple Silicon native games for the new Macs. So there's this chain of development that needs to happen, and that can be a very slow process to go through too. So I expect that the biggest companies are going to come out with Apple Silicon native apps first, and smaller development teams without the massive resources need to do this conversion that depend on software coming out of other companies and open source groups. Those are going to take a little bit longer to be ported over. But if you want to be an early adopter, this shouldn't deter you from getting one of the new Apple Silicon Macs. It's very interesting to see a market grow in the way that Apple is making the PC hardware market grow and change with this new Apple silicon hardware. They're basically telling everyone, look at us, we can do something better than what's been done for the last 30 years. So I think it's an exciting time. My wife and I did pre-order a MacBook Air with Apple Silicon, so I will be testing out thoroughly how the Apple Silicon based MacBook Air performs when it does arrive. So stay tuned for that. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can stay up to date for when that video comes out. And remember to always keep learning. Bye-bye.